Yeah, I will say this is so far, I think, the best attended guest speaking lecture that we've had so far. So awesome, Aaron, way to write up a really compelling sounding, description and having a really compelling topic. So, like I said, I'll introduce myself. My name's Day Hagel. I'm the director of Mental Health Wilderness First Aid. And so some of you are past students or past facilitators, or past folks who have come to different guest speaking lectures. That's awesome. Mainly what we do is we provide mental health first aid training that's specific to wilderness and remote areas. So we work with a lot of tree planters, a lot of outdoor educators, search and rescue techs, First Nations, other remote area industries. Lots of really cool and interesting folks from all over come through our courses. So we have courses that are mostly run online. We also, in addition to the courses, we run I try to make it monthly, guest speaker series. So right now, obviously, we have Aaron Lyons here tonight to talk about de-escalation. We've also had all kinds of therapists and professionals come in and talk about traditional and cultural healing, to talk about trauma healing, to talk about grief and loss, to talk about using nature as a co-facilitator. Any topic, I look for topics that are relevant to folks who work out in remote areas and have something to do with mental health. And we're always looking for new ideas, so feel free to email me with any. I will point out, as you noted, as you popped in, that we are recording tonight. So the purpose of the recording is to have a record of our guest speakers. I do pop them all up online on our website, and I can drop the link for that in the chat if you'd like to scroll through our past guest speakers. And I will also say it does take me a little bit of time to go through the lecture and to get the editing done. And in the meantime, if, for instance, you raised your hand and you asked some kind of question or you told an anecdote that afterwards you think, maybe I'm not very comfortable with that particular contribution that I made being public, please just shoot me an email in the next week. And I'm happy to edit out your particular contribution if that makes you more comfortable. So I do want people to feel open to share without necessarily thinking that, everything I share is going out for the entire world to see. So that offering is out there. Let's see, what else do I need to pop up here? Yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about how I know Aaron. And Aaron, I'm just going to read your bio. So Aaron's got a long history in de-escalation training. I will put out there that Aaron and I first met when I was a youth on Saltspring Island. And I'll share my screen. One of the things that happened when we moved to Salt Spring and I was about 14 or 15 years old is my mom put me in summer camp. And in summer camp, we went kayaking, we went hiking, and here I am at about 15 years old, and Aaron was a camp counselor, outdoor educator at the time. And so that's how we very first met. And then over time, Aaron's introduced me and mentored me through a lot of different things, including the Canadian Outdoor Leadership Program. He kind of pointed me in that direction. The Canada World Youth Program, where I went to South Africa and volunteered as part of that program. Aaron also pointed me in that direction, and he also introduced me to the world of restorative justice. And so I became a restorative justice facilitator and board member in Victoria for quite a few years. And a lot of that was due to Aaron's influence as well. So thanks for all that, Aaron. Aaron, I'll just read the bio that I have up for you. So folks will probably be familiar with this, but so Aaron Lyons is an experienced and passionate restorative justice specialist and peace builder with extensive international service in facilitation, consultation, coaching, and training. Since 2002, he has designed and led innovative projects across sectors from Arctic communities to Hong Kong, Brazil, and the Middle East. And I believe New Zealand's also in there. Is that not true, Aaron? Yeah, a lot of different places. Aaron's support for individuals, groups, and organizations is shaped by years of frontline experience working alongside people impacted by and responsible for acts of violence. In 2018, he co-founded Just Outcomes Counseling, which supports communities and organizations in reimagining just responses to harm and its causes. Born and raised on Canada's West Coast, Aaron was initiated into the work of facilitation by his years as an outdoor outdoor leadership instructor. After living in Jerusalem during university, Aaron's early passion for peace building led him to design and facilitate arts-based dialogue initiatives for Israeli, Palestinian, and Canadian youth. He went on to support adjudicated young men struggling with violence and substance abuse in British Columbia. Aaron is an untrained blues musician. I will add he's a great harmonica player, a small boat enthusiast, a traveler, and appreciator of great cooking. And I would say he is also a cooker of great cooking. He lives with his wife and 2 adventuresome boys here on the West Coast. So you can add to that however you see fit. Aaron, I will turn it over to you. Oh, wait, just before I do that, I will drop in the chat in just a moment here. I will drop in the chat for everybody. So some of you contributed ideas for this training on de-escalation, ideas of situations in the field where there might be some potential escalation or conflict. And Aaron and I read through those. I've worked on summarizing them and making them into more kind of readily, maybe relatable scenarios. And so we have a little scenarios document. It's got 3 different scenarios in it. We will use it for a breakout room activity here shortly. So I will drop that in the chat, as well as a link if that makes it more accessible. So part of this will be watching Aaron. Part of this will be, we'll do some breakout room activities. I will say, if for whatever reason you're not in a position to participate actively in the breakout room, please don't sign out. You're welcome to still be here. Obviously, we like to encourage you to participate in those breakout room activities. And there is also the option to just continue to listen if you can't participate actively for whatever reason. So without further ado, Aaron, I will say all our guest speakers, we're so glad to have you here, Aaron. Thank you so much for making the time for this. And also all of the opinions of our guest speakers are their own and may or may not reflect the views of Mental Health Wilderness First Aid, but we're sure glad to have you here to hear them.
Thank you so much, Janetta. What a treat. It's really an honor to get to spend this time together. And thank you for your introduction and the photo. I love that. That photo made me smile. Whereas the photo advertising the event, with the one with the wolves, that one made me a little nervous because I felt like the wolves were all kind of looking at me, wondering what's next. And yeah, thanks for the plethora of photos. Yeah, just happy to be here with you all. It's amazing how we're sort of getting used to this Zoom world. So greetings from my little Zoom pixel box to yours, all of you. Just to situate myself a little bit, as Danetta mentioned, I live on the west coast of Canada. I don't know where all of you are from, I think from far and wide, but I live on Saltspring Island, which is on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Hulkaminam and Senchothan-speaking peoples. I think just to make a connection for myself anyway, in terms of our topic this evening, I think we're really asking tonight, what does it mean to be in right relationships with people while we're out on the land or in remote areas, and especially in times of adversity. And I just want to add to that then, in light of acknowledging the land, that for those of us who are non-Indigenous to where we live, let's also perpetually ask the question of what does it mean to be in right relationships with the people of the land. And so, yeah, just wanting to invoke the question of justice and how we relate to each other, both individually and communally. So you've heard a bit about my own personal background and some of the work that has kind of guided my passion and enthusiasm over the years. I won't say too much more about that, other than maybe to share that before the work of Just Outcomes, which is the organization I helped to found and where I spend my days now doing organizational work and community work through the lens of conflict transformation and restorative justice principles. I did have my start in this in the work of wilderness guiding, and it was from a young age. And I think what drew me to that was both a passion for the outdoors, which I know I share with many of you, all of you probably, but also really a passion for what is possible when we're faced with adversity. And of course, that's partly, when we're in the outdoors with people and there's difficult situations that occur in nature, right? Strong wind, heavy rain, big currents, whatever it might be that you're dealing with, cold, heat. But also the opportunities for growth and development that occur within our interpersonal dynamics. And I was from a pretty young age drawn to who do we become and who do I get to become when we're dealing with conflict and tension within groups. So that part of my passion is what kind of had me gravitate into. I seemed to spend a number of years doing work that situated me in whatever was the most challenging context for me personally. That's what I was gravitating to. And for some years, that looked like working in the youth justice context as a youth worker for young men who were court ordered to be in addictions treatment programming. And so I'll share a little later on some of the experiences that I had in that setting. But I will say in that setting is where I probably had the most opportunities for practicing de-escalation. And that's where I think about a lot. So I want to share with you a quote, if I can just share my screen, that has, I think, been guiding for me in the work that I do, which is by Theodore Zeldin. Are you seeing my screen right now? Can I have a thumbs up on that? Okay. That the kind of conversation I'm interested in is one in which we start with a willingness to emerge a slightly different person. And this is something that I hope is true as we guide, as we lead, as we accompany people in the outdoors and in remote locations, but also even here this evening and how we relate to the subject at hand. So I'm offering that as an invitation. To give you a little map of where we're headed over the next hour and a bit, I want to introduce you to some principles that I have found through the work of restorative justice and de-escalation and a range of contexts and applications, that these principles of engaged listening have been meaningful throughout. And I want to introduce you to those principles and suggest to you that actually by rooting ourselves in principles, we're going to be far more effective and adaptable than if we just have tools. Tools are important, and we'll talk about some of them tonight as well, but principles are kind of the why behind the tools, right? And that's what makes for a good practitioner when it comes to conflict work. Then, as Donetta referenced, I want to help us get into work groups. I'm calling them work groups, even though that sounds daunting, because I just want you to be a little bit prepared for what's coming. I hope it's also fun groups, but there's work involved. And then we'll have some discussion after that. And from that discussion, and as time allows, I want to be able to give you a kind of a 4-step process that can help you sort of hook your learning, your techniques, and both what you gain here this evening, but also what you have previously learned or will learn in the future into some steps that can go into de-escalation work. So that's the intent. So any questions or unaddressed needs from the group so far before we continue on?
I will put out there, I forgot to mention, please feel invited, everyone, to introduce yourself in the chat. It would be great to hear just briefly, where people are from or what brought you here or what kind of work you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And we will have time in the small groups too to speak it out loud, but it's always nice to get a little smattering with the group. Okay, I would like to try something with technology, if you'll allow me. We're going to use a tool called Mentimeter. Some of you may have used this before, and if not, check it out. So this is the home screen for this application, and basically you have two choices to get into this. You can either take your phone and use your camera and just use the QR code there to get in. Or you can, if you're on a different device or if it's easier for you for some reason, you can go to menti.com and enter that code, 68275482. That's on your screen, and that should let you in. So I'm going to give you a moment to do that. I see at least, so there's 2 people, 5, 6, good. So you're having some success. Let me know if this is just all too confusing and I can try to help. Okay, I see 10. When in just a moment, I'm going to go to the next screen. It's not the last chance you have. You can still go to menti.com and enter the code if you didn't get a chance to yet. We're going to be building something called a word cloud in a minute. But I want you to start to think about the situations that you deal with. And I understand that there's people from a variety of leadership contexts here. Some of you may be newer to the field, and many of you have long experience in the field. And you've probably got some stories, some things that come to mind that would have brought you here this evening. And maybe it's hard to think of a work-related incident right now, and maybe what you want to call to mind is situations in your family life or in your community where there's a challenge interpersonally, where you're in conflict with somebody or where you're being faced with challenging behaviors. So if you can, try to conjure up in your mind an example or two. And the question I want to invite us to ask ourselves is, what are the qualities that you would want to be true about yourself in relationship to that situation? So if you were to imagine yourself, let's say, in a family conflict with a sibling, somebody that you care about, but that the issues are sticky, and then you're driving home from that conversation and you're reflecting on what just occurred, and if you were to be proud of how you undertook that conversation, proud of how you related to the other person, what would have been true about you? What could others have observed? So that's what I want to invite us to think about. Now, in this next part of your screen, what you should be able to see is, are you getting, okay. Oh, you're already ahead of me, good. So you should be able to write down some qualities that would be true of you. So I'm seeing grounded, honest, regulated, trustworthy, compassionate, patient, calm, generous, love, authentic, curiosity. In the word cloud, the words that are repeated more than once get bigger. And that's what we're seeing with patient, grounded, compassionate, etc. Give it just another 30 seconds or so. I think it's allowing for 3 responses, and that's hopefully what you're able to offer in there too. I'm glad you're having more success than me. For some reason, I didn't manage the Mentimeter tonight, but if you did, that's what really counts. Yeah, so have a look. See what's coming up. This is the values that we aspire to together in this group when it comes to adversity, when it comes to important and honest and difficult conversations. And what I notice is that there's not a lot here that speaks to winning over the other person or overpowering their point of view or avoiding the situation. And if we can root there and in the ways that you have just indicated, whether it's in situations of conflict or where there's been a harmful event or where people are getting emotional and ungrounded, that will be part of the compass that can guide us. I love the words that you wrote, and I will make sure to capture this and include it with some follow-up materials that Janetta is perhaps in a position to send out for those interested. So thank you for that. I'm going to talk about some principles that stem from these kinds of values. And I hope that these are principles that make sense to you and that you can use in your work. So let me go back to my screen. There we go. So 5 principles of engaged listening, and these are from Carolyn Schrock-Schenk, who's an instructor at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding, or was, in Virginia, in the United States. So, number 1, listening and understanding is about respect, not about agreement. So we can disagree, but seek to understand. And that understanding is rooted in the belief that a person's inherent worth and dignity is intact, that the person that we're in communication with is somebody who has important and valid underlying concerns and needs and values that need to be paid attention to. There's a recent experience that comes to my mind where we were working with a community of people who were very deeply polarized. And we took a number of the most polarizing issues in this community, listed them on a piece of paper, and asked people to indicate whether they would agree strongly or disagree strongly with that statement. And after that, we divided them up into groups according to who they disagreed with the most. And the instructions of the activity were important. They were, we want you to listen fully to understand what's most important to the other person that you're speaking with. Not to debate, not to see if you can come to an agreement, not to problem solve, but simply to understand what is most important, what's driving their position on this topic. And even in the most polarized of environments, this was an activity that led to greater unfolding of understanding. So that's the kind of listening that we're talking about through this principle. Number 2 is listen loosely to the words and tightly to the meaning. So people's words are not always well chosen. We know this. And underneath those words or through those words, pay attention to the unspoken elements, the motivations, the emotions, the worldview that's behind those words and what's being said. And people will sense that when you lean in on that level, that there's a safety and a willingness that they have then to lean in to you, just as you have. So number 3, stay curious and open rather than assuming and judging. So I will share, a couple of weeks ago, I was in the city, I was in Vancouver, and I was trying to park at Kitts Beach. You guys know where Kitts Beach is, some of you, on a Saturday, on a sunny Saturday. And my wife was driving the car, and there's people trying to park everywhere. and we're waiting and waiting for a spot with our blinker on as somebody's about to pull out. And then just as we're about to back into the spot, another car turns as though he's going to take the spot. So I get out of the car and I'm like, and I come walking up to the car. I'm like, we were just waiting for that spot. I just came out to set him straight. I didn't come out for a conflict. He leans out the window and he's like, you think you can go right around me after I've been sitting there with my blinker on this whole time, right? And so, obviously what had happened is that I had made the assumption that he was trying to steal my spot. He had made the assumption that I was trying to steal his spot, that neither of us had the right, but that we were trying to butt in, right? So that's a very, very common occurrence in conflict, right? That we're driven by assumptions about the other person's intent. And when it comes to those kinds of assumptions, when I assume that you're trying to steal my spot, what are you really hearing? You're hearing that you're the type of person, or I think you're the type of person that would steal somebody's spot. In other words, you're less good, you're less valuable, you're less worthy. And as soon as we hear that, we react, right? We want to defend ourselves in that because it's a character thing, right? So assumptions, even though they're very common, run deep and they hit hard when it comes to the impact of conflict. I know you're all wondering who got the parking spot, but you'll just have to be patient about that. So the other person will usually listen to you after, but only after being heard and understood by you. How do difficult conversations normally go? It's usually more like, let me tell you how I see it. Okay, fine, but let me tell you how I see it. Try instead, tell me more about how you see it, right? So tell me more about how you see it. And once that person has been fully heard and understood, then ask permission for them to listen to you as you tell them how you see it. And do so fully and tell them fully how you see it once you know that you have their listening ear. And lastly, listening is more of an act of will than an act of skill. I like this one because it rhymes, but it also is exceedingly true. Many of you probably have some kind of training or have been exposed to ideas of active listening. Like who here, for example, I can't see a lot of you, but you can use your raise hand or whatever, an emoji, if you've heard of paraphrasing as a communication tool. Anybody heard of that? Yeah. Okay, so a bunch of you have. Now, paraphrasing is one of those tools that can be very useful or it can be extremely irritating, right? Because all of us have heard people try to paraphrase when they're just using the tool, when it doesn't really mean anything. And what I find fascinating is that there's actually been some research into when is it, or under what circumstance is it that people feel like they're being most heard and most listened to. And what matters the most is not the correct application of the tool. It's not the perfect paraphrase where you just nailed it. What matters the most, and you can probably guess, is that the person really cared and wanted to know and really was trying actively to understand the other, and that came through somehow. So even if they got it wildly wrong, that they were making the attempt. So that shines through. So those are 5 things that I would suggest could act as a compass for us in situations of adversity, of challenge, of tension, in situations where de-escalation is required. Let me pause for a second. Sarah, I see your hand. Is it that you know paraphrasing, or is it that you have a question? Hand is down. Okay.
I'm so sorry. I'm still learning how to use Zoom Mobile. My apologies.
No worries. It's all good. I am too. So I'm going to share with you a brief clip that speaks to the power of assumptions, but I first need to reshare my screen so that you've got sound. Oh yeah, no, it's there. All right, here we go.
Hey, kid. You got to get down. Come on.
Okay, so hopefully you caught that. Just one of many examples of don't judge too quickly of how we get trapped in our very rational, logical seeming, but nevertheless often incorrect assumptions about situations, and how those assumptions and judgments perpetuate and deepen conflict and can escalate the situation. Okay. So let me introduce the next piece, which is less of me and more of you. So we're going to be in our work groups, and you're probably going to be with some folks who you've never met before, and that's a good thing. Hopefully you will have a chance to engage with people whose perspective and lived experience is different than yours. I am going to invite, not require, but certainly invite that if you can turn your videos on while you're in the small groups, it really helps and enhances the experience for others, if that's possible for you. So 3 steps, and I will drop this into the chat before we go. So yeah, take 1 minute, 60 seconds to introduce yourself, each of you. Who are you? Where are you? What brought you here in brief? Like what's the motivating question or the types of situations that you encounter? This is not a long storytelling, just for time. And then what we're going to invite is applying the principles that you just heard about to one of the scenarios provided, or to a real scenario from your group that one of you is dealing with. So you have some flexibility. You can look at the scenarios that we're going to drop into the chat in a moment, or come up with your own. So the question, the real heart of this work is, what would it look like or sound like to work with the situation that you've chosen? So just one situation agreed upon by your group. If you are paying attention to these principles, if you are guided by those 5 principles, and I'll share those again too. So, and if you're able, we're inviting you to come prepared to offer an example to the large group of what that would sound like or look like to apply that principle. So it's all voluntary. There's no pressure or obligation. You're not going to be quizzed on anything, but we will have a group discussion after to see what we've come up with. And the more we can engage with each other on it, I think the more we'll learn. I've just put into the chat a handout for this workshop, and it is more material than what we'll be able to cover this evening, but I've included some of the skills components because some of you might be interested in really reading through that and working on it. But the page that we're focusing on right now and for this activity is page 2, 5 listening principles. So page 2 of that handout, once you have it open, and you'll want to also open up the examples that Janetta shared. Welcome back, all. I hope the conversations were rich. I know 20 minutes can actually fly by when we're engaged. So it's probably hard to really do the work of applying principles. You've got one document over here, one over there, and 4 personalities right in front of you. I'm just curious to just briefly check in with groups and see. We don't have to go group by group, but just if there's any example that the brave ones among us could offer about what it would look like or sound like to begin to apply these principles to a scenario.
I can talk.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi. So Hannah and I talked about scenario 3, which is the physical, there's a physical contact aggression problem in camp. And our main thing that we talked about was that in situations like this, it can be quite easy to approach the situation with a lot of judgments about who's responsible and just bringing in your preconceptions about things, why the situation happened and like who should be blamed and things like that. So like by applying the principles, one thing you can do is kind of just trying to approach the situation on an equal level and like really listening to everybody that was involved in the conflict and trying to let go of those judgments of kind of who was initially at fault so that you can really understand what's going on. Yeah.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, I really appreciate and agree with your perspective about approaching the situation without a lot of preconceived ideas, without snapping to an immediate judgment. I really wish that I could live by that advice when it comes to my children. It's not always easy. Those of you who are parents may be able to relate. And one of the things about that scenario that strikes me is the distinction between conflict and violence. And this is not, obviously in our time together, something we can really expound on, right? But when people commit violence towards one another, that's actually different than conflict, isn't it? Right? Conflict is like we're taught it's a creative thing that people can engage in constructively and learn more about each other and what's important to one another. There's all kinds of positive potential in conflict. Violence doesn't have the same potential, and it actually acts to suppress conflict a lot of the time. And so being able to have conversations with people, even if there's two people who are both responsible for violence that arose out of a conflict, being able to have conversations with people about their use of violence and being able to coach people in the direction of a sense of real accountability and responsibility for addressing that violence is something that I would say is kind of another layer of the work of peace building and a restorative approach that would extend beyond just simple de-escalation skills. So this scenario lends itself to all kinds of skills and analysis, actually. And so thank you, Amanda, for bringing that up. Other examples and thoughts? Yeah, Josh.
Yeah, so in our group, we were talking about, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, just fine.
Great. We were talking about scenario 1, and I think at least in my mind, I had it as kind of a youth perspective, and maybe like a teen pushing boundaries, climbing up a rocky outface. And when we were just starting to leave, we were starting to talk about how like maybe it's get like friends are pushing you to climb up. You really want to show off. This is a person who's kind of been pushing those boundaries for maybe a sustained period of time. And then, at some point there's a group decision where like, oh, this person has pushed it too far. And as we all know, climbing up is a lot easier than climbing back down. So you've kind of made this group decision where like, oh, this is unsafe. And it's like, hey, it's time to come down. But at this point, you've been walking on eggshells, maybe talking to a person in this kind of kind, compassionate, level-headed tone as a guide you can. But at the end, it says like, you can feel your blood pressure rising. And you know, that's an indication that you need to like take a step back and take a deep breath. But I guess my question is, you know, at what point do you, like, we were talking about how to enter into that conversation that's in the handbook, in the you know, thing that you gave us. At what point do you have to like really work to get that person off of that cliff? And, you know, is it ever okay to like let that top blow and be like, hey, this is totally unsafe, like you need to get down right now? Because not only are you putting other people at risk as well as yourself, but now you've made a guide mad, and that's the scary thing.
Right. Yeah, this is a great question, Josh. And I think what you're sort of alluding to here is the concept of assertion, right? And assertion is when we are in a place of both requiring results, so applying pressure to make sure that an outcome is reached, that this young person, say, get down from the cliff. And at the same time, that we're maintaining rapport. And I think importantly, and what goes along with that is, and it's the clues there with the blood pressure, is that it's very difficult to be assertive when we ourselves are extremely triggered, right? That's the part of the difference, I think, between being assertive and, say, being aggressive. And sometimes it can feel like in real life, it can be hard to know which is which, or, you know, it's maybe a spectrum. But assertion is when, and one of the big words that you all named in your word cloud earlier on was the word grounded. So assertion is being able to make very clear, very direct requests, but in a grounded way. And it doesn't mean necessarily keeping a calm or a quiet and gentle voice, right? So as you're saying, it could form a very like the volume could go up, but it's different than it. You know, it is different than yelling at a kid, right? It has a different quality, and so you know, I think if we imagine a sort of a grounded, whatever the grounded form of that assertion would be, is something about what we're shooting for. One place I would suggest we look for clues in the kind of stance that it could take to communicate in that setting is in the handout. On page, I'm going to find it for you, on page 9. There's this concept of I statements, which, again, some of you have probably heard of, and they could sound, you know, very contrived if we're not practiced with those. But I statements at the heart is being able to communicate the impact of something on us as a leader, or on the group, in a way that doesn't, it's not so much about blame, right? When we say, I get uncomfortable, I'm really uncomfortable with where you're standing, and I'm really, and I'm starting to feel stress and, you know, fill in the blanks. That doesn't blame somebody, right? And so it's more possible for them to let in what you're saying, as opposed to defend themselves and saying, I'm not being that way. And so, yeah, just think about I statements and how it would apply to those kinds of more heated situations would be great. Thanks for raising that one, Josh. Yeah, there's probably time for one more example if you have one, others in the group. AP, is that a hand? Great.
We talked about the same scenario in our group. Had a couple different conversations that kind of slot into that one. One of which was recognizing that this is a challenging scenario because of the safety aspect, and thinking about the principle that asks you to not come to an agreement. And thinking that, at least when I was talking, I would probably go into this conversation, whether in the moment or afterwards, with in the back of my mind the knowledge that in the end of the conversation, I was going to need an agreement if it was a safety issue, and then thinking about how that might actually need to be two different conversations, even if they're in the same time frame. And then we also talked a lot about opening that space for the person who was climbing to be able to express what they're feeling in terms of like what is leading to these risky scenarios, whether it's like, as Josh said, like peer pressure or getting egged on by a group, or whether it's like a need for freedom from like a structure that isn't being met, but trying to really engage for that so that you can make a roadmap going forward from there.
Thank you, AP. Yeah, I can see how there could be a kind of a dissonance or a tension if we're thinking that we don't need an agreement, but as you're rightly saying, there sure is a need for an agreement here. And so how do we apply that principle? And I think, maybe one of the keys here is really to think about timing, right? And how in this moment, the word that we'll probably want to think about in relationship to this is containment, right? There's a need for containment. There's a need to draw limits and to create safety and to ensure that things are not escalating further. So containment really, if you think about like an oil spill or something like that, like it's just containing it means putting a boundary around it, making sure that it's not getting bigger. And so that is an important concept, right? Whereas the conversation that can occur later, where we're debriefing with this client and saying, so what's happening on the trip for you? Like, how is this going? And like, what's coming up for you? And we give you instructions. And what would it, have you been feeling about the trip? That conversation is one where we could approach it very clearly with that principle in mind of it's not about agreement, it's about respect. And in that moment, it's about just trying to understand more of where they're coming from, even if we have a different opinion. And then we can still work from that place once we've understood more fully to try to come to agreements that prevent this from happening in the future. So I can see a risk there in the way that principle is worded, that it could send a signal to somebody that agreements aren't important. And I think that AP, you're pointing out that they are, and it's really true. It's just a question of how and when. Yeah. So I think one of the really valuable things about your insights, your feedback and examples is that it lends itself towards needing kind of a context for these principles, right? Like, when do we apply what, and how does it all fit together? And so even though, we're in a very abbreviated session here, want to point you towards kind of a stepped process that could be, useful for further inquiry and study and learning for those of you who are passionate about this topic. So I'll go ahead and share my screen back. I'll probably try to limit, I'll need to limit myself to about 10 minutes or so to talk about some of these concepts. And then we'll have 5 minutes or so at the end to just, if there's any burning questions, as well as perhaps offering you just a couple of follow-up resources and things like that. So I'd like to just suggest that de-escalation can be thought of in 4 steps. And this is in your manual. I'm going to try and find it for you, unless somebody's already got the page handy. Okay, where are we at? Yes, page 3 lists these. And the first, and this is not described in detail in the handout, but the awareness stage, right? So this is a stage which I think people who are in outdoor leadership really get inherently and intuitively, the need to be aware of our surroundings, right? This is how you're trained. And in situations of escalating conflict or emotion, you know, some of the things we want to pay attention to obviously are, you know, what are the sources of safety and what are the sources of threat, right? So kind of an environmental scan of like, what are the things that could be, you know, where's the cliff, or where's the rock that a person could pick up, or, you know, what are the things that could lend themselves to danger? Where are the exits from this situation? Should we need an exit? Those kinds of thoughts. And of course, meanwhile, the awareness also applies right here at home, right? Like right within. What am I feeling? What are my beats per minute at the moment, right? And what's happening with my breathing rate at the moment? And what am I telling myself? And is there ways that I need to ground in order to think more clearly about the situation? So those are the kinds of things that go into awareness. And you know, it may be helpful to think too about territory. When people are escalating, they tend to need more space around them. Their sense of territory goes up, their need for territory increases. And so if we come in right in close to people, it can sometimes be more threatening for them. But then if we have a safe distance, which, you know, think about perhaps 2 arms lengths away is a kind of a general rule for distance when somebody is escalating. And you also might think about, I mean, body language is really important, but bring an awareness to even the way you're standing, and having an awareness that standing directly squared off with a person can send signals of threat. Standing sideways to a person can be awkward and hard to talk, whereas standing at a 45-degree angle, kind of a frontal turn, we could call it, is a stance that can lend itself to a more defensive posture physically, if there is actually a physical threat, and then also a more collaborative stance. It sort of suggests we're working together towards a common goal as opposed to opposing one another. So those are some of the dimensions. And of course, eye contact would factor into, and how we use eye contact would factor into our body language in a big way. So containment is a step that we've just alluded to, right? This idea of drawing boundaries around something so it doesn't get bigger. This is also in the handout in some more detail. And so there's a few strategies that you might want to consider here. One is to intervene promptly. So this little very simple diagram describes what's called the escalation cycle, or people refer to it affectionately as anger mountain, where it's sort of this physiological rise and fall that occurs when people are triggered. So there's the trigger, something that one interprets as a threat. There's a point of escalation where we're sort of flooded with a lot of chemistry of fight, flight, freeze, and those types of responses, the chemistry that tries to protect the organism in some fashion. And then there can be, in these moments, a state of you know, a crisis that occurs. And I'll give you an example. And by crisis, I mean physiologically. I was a youth worker, as I mentioned, and in that context, I was 1 week on the job, and I was really flying by the seat of my pants, working with kids who were coming right out of custody, and many of them knew each other from custody and had that dynamic with each other. Plus, they're all coming off hard drugs, and many of them in some sort of extended state of recovery. So of course, they're testing me and wondering who I am and all of this. And I'm on the basketball court with a group of kids, and I had gone over to the sidelines, and one of the guys, I'll call him Johnny, he was one of the kids in the group, started elbowing other kids and kind of pushing them around. And he was somebody who I had already identified as kind of as a problem, right? So I was already filtering him through my judgment and my interpretation. And So I called over from the sidelines. I was like, "Hey, Johnny, you need to cut that out, right?" Or something like that. So he turns around and he says to me, "Have you got a fucking problem, Aaron?" So that's the escalation. Okay, that's where his organism is going. Okay, is it on or is it not on, right? And so me, in my great wisdom, confirmed for him that it was on. I said to him, "Yes, I do have a problem." And I stood up and I walked towards him along the basketball court, which in my mind was, I need to talk to you about this problem that I have, and I'm not going to shout with you across the basketball court. And that's not exactly how he interpreted the situation, right? I stood up, say, "Yes, I have a problem," walk towards him. So he blew up, right? And you can just imagine, a kid who's had to fight for his survival. So he came at me with his fist swinging, and it was, staff holding him back, and the whole thing, right? So there we have a scenario of missing the cues and exacerbating the problem, right? So we can learn from those moments, and so what in containment, what we want to be able to do is to get in there with some strategies early enough that we can prevent that kind of escalation moving into crisis from happening further. Because once it does, it's almost like it has to run its course. You got to let the cycle complete, and so the main point then becomes about just creating safety in any way that you can for the person and for yourself and for the group. So hopefully that lands. Some other strategies that we might use, and I wish that I had thought about them in Johnny's situation. Use names, right? This is a universal sign of respect, right? Because people often who are becoming escalated are wondering something very important, and they're wondering, am I being respected in this situation? Right? So any way that we can demonstrate respect, and a name is one way. So is listening. And we've talked about some of the principles of listening, and in your handout, there's skills associated with listening. Help them save face. This is not something I did at all in my interface with Johnny, right? He was now in front of all of his peers, and really the only source of respect that he had, and was being called out by a new staff person from across the basketball court. So, of course, face saving would be his number one priority. So help the person save face by avoiding confrontation, removing them from the situation. What if I had just asked to talk to him somewhere else, for example? How might that have changed the situation, right? Again, and along those lines, so change settings. I accidentally moved my slide. Change settings to a new location, or to ideally somewhere outside. And that's not a problem for you all. Give choices so that people aren't bound by feeling like they're being controlled by what you're saying, and to use non-threatening language like I and we, rather than you, right? And we talked a little bit about that in the case of the cliff. So those are some things to think about when it comes to containment. And again, that's just creating the context for which you could do other types of work. Now, the work of problem solving that comes after that, and saying, okay, what are we going to do now about the cliff climbing and near-death experiences on camp? Or what are we going to do now about the punching that led to the bloody nose? Like those kinds of conversations, like addressing the actual problem. That's a whole arena, right? Of how do we work wisely to try to solve problems. And I'll just I'll need to wrap soon, but I'll share a brief anecdote with you that hopefully can raise our curiosity about problem solving. And even though this is an onion, you know, I'll give you a story that has to do with actually an orange. So two brothers, my brother and I both want the orange. There's only one orange, and you know, my mother's there. She's got this one orange, and we are both absolutely adamant that we need to have the whole thing, right? So in my mother's situation, what would you suggest she do? Cut it in half, says Rodolfo, right? Just slice the orange in half. And so she does that, hands it to us, each a half, and both my brother and I throw the orange on the ground, absolutely miserable and furious with the outcome. Why? Because that's not what we were looking for, right? There was something else driving our demand for the orange, and it didn't get satisfied by that half an orange. So what if instead my mother had said to us, what's important to you about the orange? Why do you want the orange? And she would have found that for me, I wanted the orange so that I could make orange cookies. Now, everybody knows to make orange cookies, you need the full rind of the orange. You need all of the zest, pardon me, of the orange. And my brother, turns out, wanted to make an orange cake. And everybody knows that you need all of the juice of the orange in order to make a cake, right? So do we have a conflict? Now it's a different kind of conflict. Now it's a different kind of conversation in which both of us can achieve something that is important to us without having to win over the other one, right? So that's what they call a win-win situation. And another way of understanding that is talking about positions versus interests. The idea that I want the orange that's our position. And in conflict and in negotiation, we're always going to be coming in with some kind of position. What is underlying that? What's the fundamental interest or need that's beyond that? And part of the work of conflict and even of de-escalation is being attuned to that in people, and finding out what really are their interests and what's their primary motivations, and how do we have the conversation at that level rather than at the level of positions. So I'm aware of time. There's lots more we could chat about, but hopefully there's something to chew on there for you. One thing I'll do before we have to absolutely split is just share a couple of resources with you. And I'm going to find them first in my notes. So one is I'm going to share with you the website of Just Outcomes, which is the organization that I help to run. There's an 8 in front of it. There doesn't need to be. And the work that we do is with organizations, usually forming longer-term partnerships to work on issues of trauma and of justice, and to work on systems that can respond in humanizing and restorative ways to those circumstances. So that's us. I'm going to repost it so that you don't have a number there. The other thing I'll mention is the Crisis and Trauma Resource Institute, which is known as CTRI, is a Canadian organization run by friends and colleagues who offers a lot of sort of 1-day and 2-day trainings on topics like this. So if this is an interesting area to you and you want publicly accessible training across Canada, you might want to check out their website and see what's happening in your area. So with all that, thank you for your engagement. Thank you for your time. Wish we could meet in person. And I know it's 7 o'clock, or here it is, and you'll probably have to run. So I'll turn it back to Danetta if you have any closing or final housekeeping that you want to cover before folks depart.
Yeah, this is beautiful. Thank you so much. I mean, Aaron, you and I had conversations before this about, preparing for this chat, and we just talked about how, this could be a 5-hour training or a 2-day training that we could put on, and you've just managed to pack so much richness into this, and also your experience and the anecdotes really help that to come through. So please keep in touch, folks, with your ideas, your reflections. I am interested in, this often happens with the guest speakers, right? I bring guest speakers on who can speak to an area of expertise that I don't have, and then I look for ways to incorporate it into our own curriculum. So if that's of interest to other folks, then please, provide that feedback or let me know what would be helpful. I will say I've taken trainings with Aaron before, myself through CTR and through restorative justice organizations. And those are great ways to get involved too. If you are interested on the community level, is often there will be a restorative justice organization in your community, and in exchange for such and such volunteer commitment, they may provide training that's very similar to some of the things that Aaron's been talking about. So really appreciate that. And thanks so much for your time. Everyone, thanks for your participation. I know it's quite something to be thrown into briquet rooms with folks that you don't know and be asked to engage on important issues. But also thanks so much, Aaron, for coming here and sharing with us.
You bet. Thank you for the invite. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your evening.
I really, really appreciate this, the ability to connect like this. But while I have you here, I really want to draw on your experience. And this is a super multi-layered question here, but I want to get specific about the context of, intoxication, substance abuse, and maybe even withdrawal. But like, how do you maintain that awareness and that containment? Specifically when you're trying to problem solve or reason with somebody who maybe is under the influence or maybe is experiencing withdrawal symptoms, and maybe they can't be reasoned with at that time. Does that tactic change? And does that tactic, kind of like our awareness, containment, problem solving, it could be really difficult to try and talk sense into someone who's under the influence. So I'm curious what your thoughts are there, and I'm curious whether your thoughts change when you're dealing with a client versus a colleague. Maybe it's somebody you've worked beside all summer, and then all of a sudden they just flip. So I'm curious what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, these are great questions, Josh. I mean, I think we all struggle when we are encountering somebody who's under the influence, and it's very hard to predict what they're going to say and do, and it's it really throws a wrench in the process. But in some ways, somebody who's under the influence of a lot of adrenaline is also kind of unpredictable, right? Or there's similar risks associated, there. So in a way, it's like, the part of the idea of containment is to try whatever mechanisms we have to try to bring the situation under control, given the chemistry of the situation, and de-escalate it. The only thing that I know to do in those circumstances when somebody is intoxicated on drugs, alcohol, or adrenaline is to try the things that we know, and then if it doesn't work, to disengage with the situation. So basically, to say to them, I think that we'd be better off talking about this when we're both calm or sober. And I mean, disengaging is the only real important value there is to make sure that we're disengaging in a way that preserves some relationship, so that we're not slamming the door in somebody's face, metaphorically or literally, and then to try to come back to the situation later when they're more stable. I agree. You can't do reasoning with people who are heavily under the influence. In terms of colleague versus client, that's an interesting question. I don't know that on the face of it that I would imagine the approach needing to change much, but there's something certainly in the relationship itself that that feels like it sets a different context, doesn't it? Like, you know, a client's expecting you to be the one in leadership, whereas a colleague sees themselves more maybe as an equal, or I don't know if that's the way of characterizing it, but we may, in the case of a colleague, want to use more language that sort of builds up their, I guess, their ego. Like words like, you know, I know you probably already have thought about this, or, you know, like, you know, I've seen you do this really well a lot of times, and I'm just wondering, could you, you know, like something that demonstrates the respect of a colleague, as opposed to, you know, so that they don't feel like they're being patronized. I think that would be the only thing that I can imagine right now changing much in that situation. But it sounds like you've got some real life scenarios that make for an interesting workplace. So I hope that the application of all this goes smoothly for you.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, and yeah, I just want to thank you both again for everything you've contributed. And I guess my final question is, who got that parking spot?
You know, he did. I'm glad you asked the question, because it makes me realize people are going to lose sleep tonight wondering that. So I don't know.
I'll have to wait till the video comes out.
That's right. That's right.
I'm
Include
so
that.
glad you remember that, Josh. It was like the punchline to the whole movie.
Right. Include that with the credits, right? It's like after the credits is like, oh yeah, the other guy.